Hi, my name is Michel Kaiser. I'm Professor of Marine Conservation at Bangor University in the UK, and I'm one of the principal investigators in a project looking at best practices for trawling. Trawling occurs on all continental shelves around the world, and it's one of the most commonly used methods to catch fish. One of the issues with trawling is that because of the fishing gear that's actually used, inevitably, when ground fish are targeted, that fishing gear comes into physical contact with the seabed. And it's this direct physical contact with the seabed that has caused concern amongst environmental groups. And the purpose of this project is to try and understand much better at a global scale just exactly what these effects are and how that might affect fish production. And then ultimately to come up with some management recommendations for a best practice for trawling that weighs up the costs and benefits of the effects of trawling and the consequences for secondary production of fish. Now, when fishing gears come into direct contact with the seabed, they physically affect the marine organisms, and those effects vary quite considerably, depending on whether those organisms are very small, like the small worms that you see in this tube here, or whether those organisms are much larger in body size, like this sponge that I'm showing you here. Understanding these effects, then, is extremely important. Now, in the past, there has been much effort focused on undertaking experimental studies and more recently looking at sort of chronic levels of fishing disturbance at the scale of the fishing fleet. What we've done in the past is generate meta-analyses and syntheses of these data to pull all that information together, because each of those experimental studies on their own is very specific to a particular type of fishing gear and a particular type of environmental context. By undertaking a synthesis of this literature and pulling the data together, we're able to make more global predictions about the consequences of those effects. And these effects were reported in two papers, Colli et al. In 2000 and Kaiser et al. In 2006. Our intention here is to fill in further the gaps that currently exist in our knowledge, as it is over 10 years since we last took the previous synthesis. The sort of information that we hope to generate is shown in this figure here. And what this figure gives us, it shows us the direct effects of different types of fishing gears, in this example, beam trawls, otter trawls and scallop dredges in different habitat types. So for example, gravel seabeds, sand seabeds and mud seabeds. And what we see is that the deviation from a control condition varies very strongly according to the type of habitat, in other words the environmental context, in which that fishing activity actually occurs. What this graph gives us is it gives us the direct mortality of animals that live on the seabed in response to that trawling. The problem that we encountered, though, is despite the fact that back in 2006 there had been over 101 experimental studies, there are still gaps in our knowledge, and particularly in the area where biogenic habitats are concerned. In other words, the sort of habitats constructed by living organisms like this sponge. However, in the intervening period, there have been far more studies undertaken, and what we hope to do in this study is to actually fill those data gaps using a systematic review approach. And one of my colleagues, Kath Hughes, will talk to you about this in another video.